Welcome to today's podcast, and today we're talking about secrets.
Yeah, so secrets, of course, pop up a lot in the kind of work that we do. We often have clients who talk about something and then they say, well, this is the first time I've ever mentioned this to anyone. And they've carried around a piece of information for many, many, many years that they feel they either have to hide away, or they feel they can't share with anyone, or they feel like they're protecting other people by not revealing this particular piece of information. So they feel like they have to keep this secret from everyone else.
Yeah, so if you think about how, if you hold on to secrets, how has that affected you in your relationships? Whether that's in relationships with your partner or family or friends. If it's things that you've needed to keep secret, how has that affected you? Because for many people, it can be very challenging. It can be the end of relationships. Although I suppose there's also that distinction between what really is a secret and what is not saying certain things. Because there are all things we don't say to each other, because we're not going to say absolutely everything.
Yeah.
But I suppose, how do you define what is a secret that leads to that sort of guilt?
Ah, yes, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? And I think that there's that, and there's also there's something about the intention or the motivation for withholding information, because you can have a sort of delicious secret. For example, you might be pregnant, you might be 2 months pregnant, and you're very excited about it, but you don't want everyone else to know yet. You want to tell them after 3 months, when you know that the pregnancy is viable, etc. So that's your kind of secret that you revel in and that you enjoy. Yeah, that's one form of secret. And then there are the sort of secrets which are more to do with having to hide something because it's associated with something that's shameful, for example, that needs to be covered up. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually when you said about some of the secrets you keep because it's a positive thing, that can be challenging too. I mean, like for example, if you imagine you go and buy a gift for your partner and you travel somewhere to get this thing, and you spend a day away and you don't want to say where you were, and you bought this really great gift, and part of you is desperate to give this. But at the same time, you've got to wait 2 months. And in your mind, you're constantly thinking, oh, I really want to reveal a secret. Your partner's saying, well, where were you that day? And you make something up. And it's because you want it to be a surprise. But it could lead to the end of a relationship. I mean, I've known this, like I bought something for you for a birthday, and it's like part of me really wants to say I've got this thing, and it's like a secret. And sometimes it's like, I've got to keep this in because it's a surprise.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can even be quite stressful.
So sort of coming back to your question there about what is a secret and what is kind of just not mentioning something. Or I think with secrets, and we haven't looked up a definition of what a secret is, but it's a sort of more conscious withholding of information, isn't it? You have some information and you're quite concerned with absolutely making sure that somebody else doesn't have that information. I think that's what I kind of think of when I think of a secret. What's your association?
Yes, well, I think that there is crossover. And I think the challenge is, how much does it affect the other person as well? Will this affect them if they know or if they don't know? And sometimes things will affect people if you tell them, but actually will have no consequence in their life if you don't tell them. And this is the challenge. This is the challenge that sometimes, it could be something that's like, for example, your parents said about your partner. And you know that if you tell them, first of all, your partner would be really upset. It could affect how they feel about you. But it's what your parents said. And, it's like, do you need to tell them that? Is it in anyone's best interest to tell them? But at the same time, you feel upset about having been told this. But, what do you think? I mean, do you think this is something you need to share with your partner that potentially could be quite damaging to your relationship?
I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on the situation, and I think it depends on you. I think if it's burdensome, I think if you're sitting on a piece of information that is a real burden for you, that creates a lot of internal conflict or difficulty for you, or can lead to relational difficulties, then maybe it does need to be brought out into the open. But if it doesn't, then maybe there is no need.
Well, I think there are some things as well that may be best spoken to a therapist.
Yeah.
Now, if it's something that you've done that may have betrayed your partner's trust, like, for example, in affairs or things like that, I think those are things that need to be brought out, need to be kind of spoken through and worked through. But maybe it's something about your past, like in the past you've done something you're really ashamed of. You've never told your partner, but you know that if you tell them this, it could affect how they see you. Now, you know, and realistically it could affect the relationship as a whole, because I've worked with people who have had their partner reveal something from their childhood, and suddenly they feel they can't be with their partner. So this is a challenge, and I think you know, some of these things is like, well, it doesn't I don't know, I don't feel it necessarily does affect your partner because it's not something in the time with them now. It's something you may need to speak to a therapist about. And that's why therapy is so useful, is because you can work through things in a non-judgmental way with somebody who doesn't know you. Because there are certain things that we don't want to talk to with our family or friends because we know that we're going to be judged. It may affect the relationship. And there are some things, though, that may be important to bring up with our partner. It's that boundary of what is appropriate to talk about with our partner and where do we need to talk about things in therapy. And therapy can also help you really make that boundary clearer in terms of actually these are things you do need to discuss with the other person, as opposed to these are things that's kind of causing you upset from your past and need to be dealt with so that you can feel more comfortable in your relationship.
Yeah, and I have encountered what you've just described quite a lot in my work with clients, that their clients have done something in the past and that they really regret now in the present tense. So they might have done something that they think is not positive, would negatively affect their relationship. And they're sitting on it, and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and the more years pass by, the bigger it gets. And it becomes this really big sort of grey elephant in the room that overshadows the current relationship. And there are lots of associated fantasies with that. Fantasies about like, oh my God, if my partner finds out what I have done 10 years ago or whatever, they're never going to love me again, that's the end of it, the relationship will end, etc. And from my perspective, what is really interesting very often about these scenarios is that I think, well, I find it quite difficult often to understand why is this such a big deal. Yeah, for me, it sounds like a kind of minor thing that happened in the past, something that might not be so awful or so bad. And I find it quite, being an outsider, so to speak, not being in the client's psyche, I find it quite hard to understand why this is such a terrible thing. So I think what's helpful then is to work this through with the client and to explore that, and maybe to consider themselves in a different light, to come back to why did you make that decision at that point in time, what led you to make that decision. Because what the work is then is also for the client to develop a little bit more self-compassion, so to speak, to understand why they made the decision that they made then, why they behaved in the way that they did, and to maybe kind of minimize the catastrophizing that's in the client's mind about something that they've done many years ago.
Yeah. I think it's also because there are times it can affect, I have seen this with clients where actually a partner revealing something from their past has had a very serious implication. Right, so there are things that can be more minor, but some things more major. And I also think that, what's happened in your past before you met your partner are things that we need to deal with ourselves internally. How you behave with your partner now is, I think, what's most important to that relationship. So, we can't change those things that we've done in the past, but we can change how we feel about them. And when we learn to kind of be more accepting of the choices we made in the past, or sometimes, situations that were imposed on us. So if we were abused when we were younger, sexually abused or physically abused in different ways, these sort of things that suddenly revealing in a relationship we're worried about sharing with our partner, which, could have some implications. Yeah. These are things I think, are important to speak to a therapist about before. And some of these things, we don't have to reveal everything in a relationship, because it's who we are right now, I think, that is most important, and who we are as part of a relationship that we're in currently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's also really important to bear in mind here is that secrets are very often driven by shame, as I said at the beginning. And shame is an incredibly powerful emotion and one of the most difficult emotions to stomach, I think, because it goes to the core of your sense of self. There's a belief or a feeling here that there's something wrong with you, that there's a part of you that needs to be hidden away, that other people must not see at all costs. So secrets very often relate to shame. So there might be family secrets, for example. There might be secrets that about something that you've done in the past that you feel awful about. For example, very often this might relate to your younger self having some sexual experiences. That's something that I hear very often, that there is a regret about a sexual encounter, that a person might feel, I wish I'd never agreed to do this, or I wish I'd never let myself into this situation, etc. So, for example, that's the sort of situation that generates a lot of shame. And shame can be quite crippling because shame can lead to chronic anxiety, for example. It can lead to a very low sense of self-worth or self-esteem. So shame is a feeling, an experience that can last for a long time and has really far-reaching consequences for your daily life. So if the secret generates this shame, then it's really quite helpful to unpack this. And as you rightly say, Tom, this has got to happen within the context of a safe environment where you feel safe to explore it with the person in front of you. So where the shame doesn't get magnified because somebody judges you, or you feel you're going to be judged by this person. So it's something that needs to be handled quite delicately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a distinction that's sometimes made between guilt and shame. And guilt could be a more positive thing, because guilt is you feel bad about something, you reflect on your choices, and as a result, you choose not to do it again. So it's where you learn from something. Whereas shame is more about seeing yourself as worthless in some way. So it's more internalized experience. And these are things that we really need to kind of work with therapy to help make our relationships better in the future.
Absolutely. Well, and I think also, I think what's interesting in terms of secrets is they're often kind of transgenerational as well. There's something that gets passed down the line in families. They're family secrets. There is, for example, shame about that uncle who did something really awful that then affected the whole family. Or some other relative who's done something, who ended up in prison, or has done something that's morally reprehensible, and then the whole family gets affected by that. So often also with secrets it's quite useful to explore that then in a therapeutic context, to see how this one thing that needs to be covered up on behalf of all the family members can have such a huge impact on everyone.
Yes, and I think actually just going back to some of the points on shame, I think part of transformation of shame, which again will often need to be worked through in therapy or counselling, is for me part of that recognition that, and we talked about this in our podcast recently on freedom actually, but it's that we make choices at the time, we make the best choices we can at that given time based on the options that we feel are available to us. We might have done things that at the time we felt, well, I'll do this act with this person because I think it will make them like me or make them love me, even though if it's something we don't want to do. We might do it because we think it would be fun, then realise actually no, this really isn't what I want to do, and then we feel shame. But we make those choices at the time because we have an idea of some sort of positive intention. We think it will be the right choice, but then it's about learning from that and knowing that actually, we didn't do this because we're not good enough, because we're unlovable, or whatever it might be. We did it because at that time we didn't have the knowledge, we didn't have the experience that we do now.
Yes, or we might have acted on a false understanding of how we should respond in certain situations. We might react because of particular pressures. And again, I come back to this example because it's something that I hear so often in therapies. Sexual encounters, early sexual encounters, where you kind of get involved with someone who doesn't actually offer you a very loving experience, and it feels very humiliating, or it might feel, there might be this real sense of beating yourself up afterwards. Why did I do that? Why did I go along with this? Why did I even waste my time with this person who treated me in such a bad way? So there's a lot of this, but there's a lot of this shame associated, but it's often driven by this kind of pressure, this sort of pressure in certain situations, a pressure to go along, or somebody else kind of egging you on, the other person really exerting some pressure for you to kind of go along with what you then later on live to regret. So often it's that sense of, well, I should really, and often and most of the time it's because you're acting on information that you haven't got yet, because your core sense of self might not be that strong enough, or you might not be quite so good at asserting yourself, or you might struggle to have clear boundaries in life because they might not have been set for you. You might not quite know what they are. So there's a lot of learning in all of this, isn't there?
Yes, there is, and there's learning about, from that, how do we act differently in the future? How can we act in ways where we feel better about our choices, our decisions? And I think also knowing, and this is maybe a little bit different, but I think it's related, is we have thoughts, and thoughts are different from what we do. We all have weird thoughts at times. We might have thoughts with our partner, sometimes thinking like, oh, I wish I could just leave them, or I wish I'd just disappear, or, it could even be nasty thoughts like, oh, sometimes I wish I'd strangle them. But that's, that's not a good thought, but sometimes we have thoughts, and just remembering thoughts are thoughts. Thoughts are not you, they're random things that come from how stressed you are, how overloaded, things we've heard people say in the past. But it's what you do that really counts. It's the actions that you take. Thoughts do not make you a bad person. Thinking about yourself like, well, I should never have done that, that doesn't make you a bad person. It's a thought that you're having.
Absolutely. There was just another thought as you were talking. It's kind of slightly unrelated, so I'm changing tack a little bit, about secrets, and also why you might be withholding information, because I think a lot of the time, so it's not necessarily always about shame, but it's also because you feel you have to hold a secret in order to protect another person. So it's this idea that you don't want to burden the other person with something. For example, you might have I'm thinking about sort of extreme scenario. You might have a terminal illness, and you might not want to tell other people about that because you feel like they couldn't cope with that. Or you might have a very severe disability that you might not want to share with other people because you don't want to burden them with your experience. Again, it's something that I've heard clients express. So at the same time, you are aware of it. You're always aware of it. This is the reality in your life. You live with this truth. And it's in the room, you always have this awareness, there's something here that the other person doesn't know about me that's actually really, really, really important in my life. So I'm not saying you have to share that secret, but you have to maybe also think about yourself here. And is it helpful? Do you always have to protect everyone from information that you think somebody else would not be able to stomach or cope with?
Yes, I'm thinking of one situation myself, just disclosing some things. There was a time when I think I was in my 20s, and I got a phone call from my mum, and I was meant to go for a job interview that day. I'd been headhunted for this job. First time I'd ever been headhunted, so I was quite excited. Mm-hmm. And I got a phone call from my mum saying, I think you need to come down. There's nothing big's happened, but I think you need to come down to see your dad. He's just gone into hospital. And I said, well, I've got this job interview. And she said, well, maybe you should come down. It was nothing major. And she was trying to kind of like cover up. And to me, it was sounding like there was nothing, there was no real issue. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, why is she so determined for me to go down? Mm-hmm. But when I went down, it turned out my dad was dying.
Oh my God.
He only had, by the time I got there, only had an hour left. But my mum, at some level, was wanting to protect me from the pain of thinking my dad was seriously ill.
Yeah.
But he was, and actually I could have totally missed going down there because I wasn't getting the message. Sometimes holding those secrets back because we think we're protecting somebody in the long run can cause them more pain. And I've seen this with other families where parents are sometimes frightened to tell their children that there's something wrong with them because they don't want them to worry. And that was the thing, my mum didn't want me to worry. But actually, then it can have a huge consequence. Sometimes that little worry in the moment saves us more kind of upset or more regret later on.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, particularly with children or with younger children, how much you let them in on, or how much you keep away from your children, or how much you sort of safeguard, with illnesses, etc. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here, but it's just something to consider, isn't it? That the withholding of information sometimes can have quite devastating consequences as well, and also for the other person, but also it's really hard, isn't it, to always keep everything in?
Yeah.
Or is it just me? I'm terrible at keeping secrets.
No, it is really difficult. I mean, I was talking about the gift thing earlier.
Yeah.
But I think also just going back to this point is, if you did have, for example, if you were told you had 3 months left and you think, well, I want to protect my child from worrying and not tell them, but then suddenly you do die, or you kind of move on, or however you want to phrase it, that regret afterwards, because that's 3 months that they could have had the choice to spend with you.
Yeah.
That's 3 months where you can have a relationship and build a different depth of relationship that might be closer than before. So in some ways, keeping secrets can deprive people of things. Rather than creating worry, it can create, it can be a very important time. And I think that's really important. But like you said, sometimes holding, even good secrets can be difficult to hold on to sometimes.
Yeah, I think it requires a lot of energy to withhold information, so to speak. I think it can be quite exhausting to do that. And particularly if you feel you have to do that a lot of the time in lots of situations, and if it's information that's actually really that you consider to be really important, it can absolutely cloud relationships. And I've sort of experienced that with clients who have withheld information from the past to their partner, and it's absolutely exhausted them, and it's clouded the relationships. Their relationship for many years, because they've been sitting on this big secret. Yes,
and I think we did an earlier podcast, on some concepts of Gestalt therapy.
The unfinished business.
So it's unfinished business, where we don't go through the whole cycle. And unless we complete, if that cycle of, like a behaviour, if I'm doing something, but I stop part of the way through, there's parts of me that feels that this is unfinished. We have this unfinished business. The same with secrets. We are not able to fulfill that cycle. So there's part of us that, this is unfinished business. So that's always there. But the question is, does this need to be finished business by disclosing this to your partner if it's something from the past, or can you have this finished business through working through it in therapy?
Yeah.
So if it's not directly to do with a relationship now, my question is, is it something you need to work on yourself? Is it even relevant to your partner right now?
Yeah.
Some things are, some things aren't.
Yeah, good point.
But we need to kind of think about, are these things I need to work on myself, or is this something that's important to disclose to my partner? And it's knowing that distinction about what's important in this relationship to know together, and what's important for me to work on myself so that I can be in this relationship. Because sometimes it's that internal unfinished business that we need to work on so we can be present in our relationship. Sometimes disclosing it to our partner doesn't make it finished business. No. It's still this unresolved thing that we need to work through.
Because it's very often, it's kind of what it means to us, isn't it? More than what it means to other people, really. And what meaning we create around this. And of course, if the meaning is, this is something really, really terrible that needs to be repressed at all costs, then that requires a lot of energy. Yeah.
Good. So I think we're going to finish off today's podcast. So thanks for listening today. Please subscribe to our podcast and head over to therelationshipmaze.com and take our free online argument quiz so you can discover your conflict style. And please tune in next week. And thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, and also maybe just a brief call to get in touch with us if there are any particular topics that you would like us to discuss in our podcast. We've had some suggestions before in the past, and as far as possible, and actually so far, we've addressed them all. So do get in touch if there's a particular issue that you think, oh, I wish I'd like to hear